their pet subjects. We're here for the forest. We're here for the people, you know, and it creates this plethora of noise, and it has to be all cut down to this very simple document.
What about Canada?
Well, we hope they're back. They left it back. We hope they're back. When we say back, we think back in the process. They left the Kyoto Protocol. They gapped it, and they have a horrible tar sand. We have to remain to be seen how much integrity. And what happens is they don't change the negotiating team. So you have a change in the politics, and then there's Stern again. Hello, mate. How are you? You're right. You're still negotiating with the US. Yeah. Sorry.
What about the Vatican? I know it's a country in its own right. It also has the potential through religious persuasion to influence some upwards.
Well, they did this thing called the Papal Encyclical. Which is actually quite a groundbreaking document. It's very progressive. It's more progressive than many of what we call progressive economies. And I think it sends a message to many people that religion and sustainable development, in the broader sense, can go together. It's about creating a better society. So we were very happy. We know a number of people who worked in that process to help that happen. And I think it was very, very, very difficult. The challenge now is to divest their monies. But yeah, so that's good. They don't have much power. They do when it comes to arguing about things like sexual reproductive rights and health in the Rio Plus 20 agreement, where they cut that out together with a few of their mates. But in the climate change negotiations, I don't think they don't have the authority. It really does come down to what I call the climate bears. Brazil, Russia, Australia, Canada. The EU is an interesting one because we negotiate as a bloc. So the UK government's a bit out of it, proud, a job, all these other laggards in the EU, they hide behind the bloc. So they're a negotiating bloc, which makes it difficult to nail people. The other thing is we have Annex 1 countries, which are countries with a long historical emissions, and they're put in this high action group of the ones that need to reduce their emissions urgently and have a higher degree of responsibility. And then you have this weird grouping, and I think this is part of the problem with negotiations, called G77. It's basically China and all the other developing countries. But that happened 20 years ago. So you've got Singapore in there. You know, you've got very, very carbon-intensive, wealthy economies still negotiating in this bloc with some of the poorest countries like Malawi. So there's a difference in how these blocs negotiate, and they do unfortunately negotiate as a bloc. So they have to agree internally to have a position, and then the EU has to agree a position. So you're getting this ratcheting down of ambition when you go to negotiating.
And just to complicate it even further, we've got these kind of neat geopolitical blocks of the developed countries, the undeveloped countries, the EU. You can almost sort of geopolitically map the world in them. But then you have these really weird coalitions of countries that got together because they were at the same college together or something. So there's the umbrella group, which has got like Costa Rica and New Zealand in it. And then there's the like-minded countries group, which is another random collection of countries. And they, because they're governments, they can constitute themselves as an official group, they get an official voice. So when you have a particular negotiation that's being debated, every country has the right to speak, but then the ones in these other groups that can speak, well, I'm speaking on behalf of 7 countries, and it might be New Zealand speaking on behalf of this motley collection of countries that they've gathered together, probably with a bunch of aid deals and some scholarships and some perks for some key ministers in order to keep that group going. But they create a political power that has no geopolitical underpinning at all. And those complicators are some of the things that stop those brackets being open and closed with the speed of which it do.
Where does Cuba sit in these?
Where does Cuba sit? It's quietly G77.
Yeah, it's quietly G77. It's a lack of
G77, group of 77 underdeveloped countries that are about 136, but they're called the G77.
Sorry, go ahead.
Just to clarify that, the process, are all the NGOs and the corporate representatives there in the same building as all the, and so you've got access to them as they're hurrying around being busy? Because that must make you busier.
Well, this is the problem. I mean, in a sense, some countries like NGOs because we give them content. So we work on the technical content of the agreement, and And we're saying, so we, there's a paper up here where you can find it on the paper website, says this is what we're asking for. But when it gets to the negotiations, we'll have a page of text towards the second week on an issue, and we'll be going, right, let's run that through the lawyers, let's look at what that says, who's getting a bad deal, who's getting a good deal, and try and put that back to them in language so they can work with that. And also to reflect the options, because it's always about trading off options. Many of the big, I mean, it's, you know, if you look at a map of who supports 1.5 and who doesn't, except for China and India, it's all the developed countries who don't support it. And in a sense, they're the ones who are kind of most closed to any kind of discussion. But they're the ones who have an incredible cadre of private sector lobbyists. Yeah. So when we had the meeting in Warsaw, and when we had the meeting in Doha, it's a meeting of the oil industry at the same time as the coffee. We go back to forth, it's great. So I jumped in a cab very late, like 4 in the morning, coming back from the negotiations. And this guy, I sort of met this chap, he said, oh, I have to share a cab here. I said, what are you doing? He said, oh, I'm a lobbyist. I said, oh, who do you lobby for? He said, for Shell. I said, oh, right. So I'm not sure whether to share a taxi with you. But let's talk. So they're there in force. And they are there to push the agreement and push those countries to where they want to go. And to be frank also, inside the process, and this is not me being paranoid, there are spooks and people who are trading information and moving stuff around. We know that from WikiLeaks, from Snowden's leaks after Copenhagen. So it's an atmosphere of distrust and sort of a bit of fear, and information is power, and ego driving things. And so in the UK, we'll quickly do that. So where's the UK? We'll come to that in a bit more detail. At the moment, as I said, they're negotiating behind the EU. They are, I love Pete Bates, he's a wonderful man. He's a lead negotiator. And but what I can't understand is he was a negotiator under the Labour government in Copenhagen. And after the Copenhagen debacle, there was a big jamboree in London. And I remember going to this jamboree, and I wanted to green slime in Miliband. And I was talked out of it, quite rightly so, on my great wife. And Pete Beck said, well, it's a great moment in Copenhagen. And I said, Pete, between you and me and the four walls, how can you stand there and say? He said, well, it was, we had progress. Well, we now know that it wasn't. It was a complete debacle. This is what we were trying to say, but they had managed this process. Brown was there, the Girl Scouts were there, Miliband was there, the stars were out. But it takes time to message. So they'll do the same again this time. And Pete's still negotiating for the current government. I think he's probably utterly depressed by that. You have a little delegation rooms where we go meet the UK government. At 12 o'clock, UK Dell meeting. Okay, what are we going to talk about? And you go, well, come on in, minister's coming, sit down, minister, hello, I'm Minister, so yes, I've got 10 minutes, yes, okay, off you go. And you have your...
Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, and you go around and do your turn. The challenge with this government is their domestic activity do not stack up on an international stage. You know what it's like. If you go to a meeting, you want to feel powerful, you want to feel important. The ministers will actually, this COP, for the first time around, talk in the first week, because the French really want them to nail it in the first week. And you have these minister speeches. You remember when it comes up on the television screen, the list of all the speeches. Oh, who should I go to? So Uganda. Oh, UK's one. Let's go and look at the speech. So they'll do a speech, and at that speech they'll want to announce how great they are. But, one thing about diplomats is they are so bright. They know things before you know them. They know the UK government's crap on its domestic climate program. So they don't trust them in the negotiations. And those members of the EU, like Germany, did, guys, you're so far behind. Poland likes them because they can associate themselves with them. So at the moment, we'll talk a bit about the actual components of the deal, the legal package and everything else we're doing. But at the moment, I would say, the UK will announce several things, probably a re-announcement of existing money. There is an announcement about coal that's been made, we may forget. But on the whole, they're the only member of the G7 whose investment in fossil fuel subsidies has gone up, and everyone else's has gone down. And that's just the marker, and that just says, you guys aren't serious. I'll stop there.
Okay, we're running a little bit behind time, and I promised myself that we would have a break. Richard?
I don't think you mentioned China, did you?
No. So what a wise person said to me, China will join the party and make a deal when it's ready to sell renewables to the rest of the world. And then win. and they're smarter. And if you look at the investment portfolios of China, it's about 24% more than the US in terms of renewables. Yes, they've got very dirty coal, they've got a lot of it, and they've got a lot of people, and a lot of people who are very poor. But they're smart enough to know that if they get on the front of the curve, they can make that investment now, and they can move. And actually, they've been very progressive. They're what's called an INDC, which I think Raj's going to come on to in a minute. It's actually more ambitious in the US. It's more ambitious in terms of getting the curve down and getting emissions down. But they're a really hard body to work with. They don't talk to
society. Yeah, they're one of the countries that don't talk to anybody else. It's really, really difficult to get an audience of the Chinese delegation. Even Chinese NGOs find it very, very difficult to talk to their country delegation. It's one of the governments. All the governments probably have got their minds made up before they go, and they're probably not going to be influenced. But the Chinese don't make even a pretense of it.
But they are a deal make or break. I would say basically two big countries, the US and China.
Okay, so very quickly, let's talk about the main issues that we are concerned about as a human race that should hopefully be resolved in Copenhagen. One is we need to radically reduce the emissions coming out of this world. Kit has already explained that in his introduction. At the moment, the emissions trajectory of the world is upwards. No matter what people say, oh, it's slowing down, what they mean is that the rate of increase might be slowing down, but actually it's still going upwards. And we are, with no action, we are heading towards a world by the end of the century that is 4 to 6 degrees warmer on average, which means 10 to 12 in some parts of the world. It's a drastic situation. I'm not being alarmed when I say that. So that's the business as usual thing. They agreed last year at the last COP that they were going to really try hard and promise to reduce their emissions. And the closest they could get with all their negotiations about Brexit text was not actually a promise to reduce emissions, but to say how much they think they might be reducing emissions. So it was called intended nationally determined contributions. A lot of negotiation went round into those 4 words even. Nationally determined is important because people were saying, you're not going to tell us, oh UN, how much we should cut. We'll decide how much we're going to cut. And intended, again, is not a commitment to anything. It's just that this is what we think we might like to perhaps maybe do. So if you pull together all the intended nationally determined contributions, submissions that have been made, the INDCs, your upward curve goes from this to that. It is by no measure anywhere near the this that we need in order to stay within 2 degrees, or the this that we need for 1.5 degrees. The peak emissions should happen sometime in the next 5 years or maximum 10 years if we are going to have a snowball in hell, literally a snowball in hell's chance of staying on the right side of the climate catastrophe equation. And it's not happening with the INDCs. So at the moment, it doesn't look good in terms of what people have said that they think that they might pledge, the INDC. The outcome of the COP should be NDCs, i.e. the intended comes out, and it will be a commitment to a certain level of reduction. They're probably not going to be much higher than the INDC, so that curve might go like this. But what would be a good outcome is if they promise that at a regular frequency, at frequent intervals, they review those, so that they get the scientists to tell them how fast the Earth is still warming, despite the fact that they've made these commitments, and thereby have some kind of leverage on them to get their commitments to be increased over time. Probably too little, too late, but it's the best that we can hope for. So we can hope for a good outcome on the emission reduction thing, which is the area that's called mitigation, would be an agreed binding frequency of review of people's contributions. On adaptation, sorry, Richard.
That seems to assume everyone accepts that the temperature rise due to anthropogenic.
Yeah.
Is that the case?
Yes. So the loonies are. There was a fantastic interview actually on the radio a few days ago with somebody who was sceptical about all of that. That lunatic fringe would continue to exist, and they get an amazing amount of airtime and media coverage in relation to the percentage of population they represent. The harder people to work with are the people who accept that it's going to happen, but don't think it's going to be that bad and think we will manage. So that's where the...
There was a group of American politicians that argued it's actually going to be good.
Yes, yes. And possibly for our countries in the high latitudes, in the short term, it will be good. You can find lots of reasons why it would be better. One is greater productivity.
If the conference can agree binding agreement, for instance, there will be penalties if they're not held.
Brilliant question.
Could you repeat the question, please?
Okay, the question is, if they can agree binding agreements, what's the penalty for not keeping to that binding agreement? The Kyoto Protocol gives us a fantastic story. Countries that committed to the Kyoto Protocol and then suddenly realized that they weren't going to meet the commitments they just left. They just left. They said, oh, well, actually, we're not going to.
The US.
So, yeah, Canada, New Zealand. So
UK too.
sorry?
The UK too.
Possibly. I'm
Oh,
not
yeah,
not
sure.
Yeah. So yes, there are no T's to the binding agreement. Nobody has ever agreed or accepted to there being some kind of punitive measure that would hold people's noses to that line.
I mean, this is a very simple you have millions of hours and energy put into a multilateral environmental agreement that has no accountability. So if you're naughty and you don't meet your targets, no one's going to slap you. And it might not even be legally binding. I mean, John Kerry is saying they can't meet a legally binding agreement because you can't make the announcement. So it's something else. So the tragedy is we're relying on good governance of all governments to deliver this thing. And that's what I think civil society voice is starting to be.
Yeah.
Is there no element of shame? Shame?
I think the challenge is
So the question was, is there no element of shame, name and shame?
we've done that with actions where you hold up a banner saying, we're killing more people. I remember jumping into a press interview at the end of the day right next to Todd Stern as a US negotiator saying, your policies are killing people. And I was ejected. But there isn't a shame, because if you're in that negotiating process, you actually have to believe in your heart that you're doing the right thing. So you can meet negotiators who are wicked people in terms of what they're doing by destroying their... But they actually fundamentally have to believe themselves. They've got to go back and be their families. They're not... I like to think in their hearts are not just people. They've got mortgages and they've got, they've got careers and they've got pensions, so they're scared. So we sort of joked about this little program where we kind of have like, help, you can get out, we'll help you out and you can be honest. But the shame thing, you see the most abhorrent behaviour. Countries being bullied or being told you won't get any money or, gender. Who's going to argue with gender equality? No, don't want that in the agreement, want that out. Things like it should be a no-brainer, And so there isn't that shame, and I think it's because of people investing careers. Shall I try and...
Sorry. Lots of questions coming up. Are they about clarification of what we've just said, or are they taking the discussion in a different direction?
About clarification.
Yeah, go ahead.
You mentioned earlier that some aspects of climate change could be seen as positive for some countries. It would be really difficult to get agreement, I'd imagine, if those countries were the ones who were really big emitters, like Russia, India, China. Is that the case, that they do see elements of climate change which could be beneficial to their massive populations?
We live in a world measured by economics. So people have done the numbers and said, and the numbers are wrong. Well, if we in the US economy come down and get our emissions down by so much, the cost benefit curve, is going to put us kind of here. And so Stern's argument always that, do something now, it costs less than more. It doesn't actually hold true for some economies because they know it's going to cost them more. So they're happy to take a longer term path out. But Russia's one of those. It's got a lot of coal, it's got a lot of gas, and as the tundra and the northern environments melt, you're releasing these massive wheat fields. So they know that from a productivity perspective, they can increase a lot of food production, but they also know the long game, they're going to be hit really hard. Really hard. So the challenge is this sort of short-termism of sort of balance sheet, looking at it from a balance sheet perspective, rather than saying, actually, take the long-term view, the balance sheet is completely upside down.
Okay, so can we just quickly, sorry, was that?
I'm just going to say, of the British politicians and civil servants, since that word was mentioned, how many of them are realistic and understand the science, or how many of them think they've got another planet they can live on?
I do not underestimate the British civil servant. I think they know their stuff, they're very well briefed, and they have the resources to understand all of this stuff. I think they are making political judgments based on instructions from their political leaders and from, I feel like, calculated risks to their own prospects. Because the science is so clear, but researchers are now really developing this area of this disconnect between how clear and unequivocal the science is and how impossible it is for politicians and society at large, actually, to heed that science and respond to it. So I don't think the issue is that civil servants don't know it or don't understand the
They have
science.
the courage to act.
I think they have it. They know it.
Sorry?
I don't think they have the courage to act, because if they act, they're out of the machine and a new cadre of civil servants are brought in.
And the politicians?
The politicians have the power over the civil servants. So I've been in meetings where you've seen civil servants arguing, or heard them arguing with the minister, and they go, no, sounds good. So the science-based, quality, I think they're wonderful people, the UK civil servants. They do great work. Half of them are elected. They're in other agencies. Should we try, I know there's lots of
There's a
questions.
couple of questions to that. I feel like I've glossed over, I'm sorry.
There was a comment relating to the sanctions discussion that I was reading New Internationalist just before coming here, and it's all about climate change at the moment. And so there was a really interesting comment from, I think she might have been a Filipino climate activist, talking about when they were campaigning for democracy, and the fact that they had to paralyse society, she described it, by going on general strikes. And she was saying it's not enough to just take to the streets, we've got to paralyse society. And I was thinking, would there be the sort of civil groups, because we all, as citizens all over the world, stand to lose if we don't do this. Could we use this as our power to keep governments to account with whatever they've agreed? Would that be...
We're going to come to this
So we're
discussion
going to come
about
to that after the break.
Is
So,
that okay?
So
hold that thought about what is it?
okay, lightning overview of a few other things that we hope will come out of COP, but I won't go into great detail on those, just because we're running out of time. Kit mentioned the 3 eras, or the 3 sort of phases of climate change: mitigation, which is reducing our emissions. We've talked about that a lot. Adaptation. A lot of the world is already suffering the impact of climate change, and they need the wherewithal to respond to that. They need money, basically, from the people who've been emitting. A phantom figure of 100 billion a year was promised in Copenhagen and has never materialized. Since then, there's been some analysis that shows that 100 billion is short of what's required, but even we haven't got close to 100 billion anyway. So there's a huge expectation that there should be some pledging of new money for adaptation to make up for the lack of mitigation that's happened in the past. It won't happen, but that people will be watching to see how much adaptation money is pledged through the COP. And then the final thing that Kit mentioned, the last phase of loss and damage, which is how you compensate countries for whom adaptation is simply no longer an option. Your island has been flooded, or the desert has spread so far into your country, you have no more arable land. There has to be some kind of mechanism for how that is calculated and compensated for. And where, at the moment, that's bracketed text. It might not even be in that treaty. finally agree. But that's one of the big battles that people are trying to fight. Do you want to say anything more on the thing before?
I'll just try and pull that again. So you kind of imagine the components of what's on the paper. There's something around how much we will all do together to reduce our emissions. There's something about who will give to who what, some technical support and some financial provision for adaptation. There's this really difficult space called loss and damage, which no one wants to talk about. There's everyone saying, yeah, we will stick to 2 degrees. But, oh, hold on, we kind of worked out it's going to be 3.8, and the rest of the guys need 1.5. So that's the kind of question. And then there's the thing about the legal form. What does the treaty actually look like? What sort of teeth does it have? And then, as Rajah said, the ratchet mechanism. How often do you look at these things every 5 years to review where we are in terms of achieving it? But the ultimate kind of message is that the UN process is a fantastic platform to do business. It's a fantastic platform to lobby and for small countries to have a voice. Otherwise, it would just be left between the G7, G20, G8. But it isn't the cavalry, and it ain't going to be the cavalry. That's got to come from somewhere else.
Sorry, it isn't?
The cavalry. It's not going to ride in, and even, you know, but also we should have said, this is a deal, about a deal, about a deal. So I looked up the Kyoto Protocol, I wrote it in my notes. It was agreed in 1997, came into force in 2005, and had its first effective period from 2008 to 2012. Well, this deal is going to come into force in 2020. What are we going to do for 5 years? Negotiate, right? So we have to think about the realistic alternatives that exist within our society to patch up those pieces. Stop.
The good news is COP22's in Morocco.
I suppose the only other thing we just didn't cover here is this issue about greenwashing. When it comes out, when you're looking at the paper, you know, we all read our own interpretations of the world and look through different things. But think about the degree by which parties have committed to reduce. There is new money, and there is political will, and there is ambition, because that is the measurement. And it will be spun, and it will be... We were kicked out in Copenhagen because they didn't want civil society telling the world how rubbish it was. The first 24 hours, headline news, BBC was, you know, great deal saves Copenhagen. 24 hours later, it was like, change that. So just think about what we call the greenwash alert. And there have been some people saying, shut down this process. Tell the world how bad it is. And then there's another side that says, if we do that, small island developing states, African groups, they're not going to have a voice. We've got, it's a really difficult thing between kicking it and saying it's rubbish, and saying it's the only game in town that gives people a voice.
So let's take a 5-minute break now for comfort, for drinks, for stretching legs, for exercising brains, talking to your neighbour, whatever. And let's come back and talk about that subject, about what we can do to hold our governments accountable, what we can do to kind of raise the game at local level and at national level. Because from what we have said, we realise it's not going to be solved